All right, welcome back to another episode of the TFD Performance Podcast. Joined again by our frequent flyer, Dr. Oliver Barley, Dr. Ollie B. Thanks again for joining us twice in 2 weeks. In 1 week, actually, twice in 1 week.
Thanks for having me. Look, I'm looking to set records here.
We're breaking records. I don't think I've had a guest on as many times as I've had you on, or I haven't had a guest on this frequent as well. We're just blowing things out of the park here.
It's just important stuff to talk about. And I think last week, as we outlined, there were things that we talked about the hydration topic, but I think there's just more to talk about. So it was easier to split it into two.
Yeah, that's true. This is a really cool topic that I did want to get to last week, but we're both busy. We have to cut it short. But I know I always preface Dr. Oliver Barley's expertise in hydration science, in nutrition science, and everything. But really, you're a physiologist by trade, and that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Yes. So yeah, that's the thing that's worth remembering, because a lot of the time I think I've been well known for the stuff around weight cutting, which is true. It's fair. That's where a good portion of my work is. But I'm a sports physiologist by trade, and that's the thing I do first and foremost. And probably my biggest interest is in high performance. And that was my interest, or is currently my interest in weight cutting, is how it affects performance primarily, because I was interested in, that's the whole reason I started looking at weight cutting in the first place, was because I was fighting, I was cutting weight, and I didn't feel great, and I wanted to know what was best for performance. I used my university account when I was a bachelor's student and went, I'll find all the research, and found there was basically nothing, and went, well, guess I'll do some of the research. But I was always driven by performance first, and some of my research now has looked more into optimizing performance anyway.
How good is that though? How many people could relate when you say that as, oh yeah, I was an athlete and I was cutting weight and I just didn't feel good? I think so many people just hear that, go, oh yeah, I'm exactly the same as that too.
Yeah, but then for some reason my response was not to cut less weight. My response was, you know what I should do? A master's degree and a PhD. It was an odd response, but I guess I'm glad I did it.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get into it, because you do train athletes, you coach athletes. Yes. Something we've spoken about a lot is the physical training that MMA athletes that they do, and the way that they condition their bodies to get ready for an MMA fight. It's very unique. And again, like you said, there's not a lot of research around it. It's not like, well, I'm pretty sure you probably could go to Google and just go MMA training program, and you probably get some very terrible cookie cutter program. Yeah. But really, we don't have a lot of evidence behind it. And from what I know, from what I've read and conversation with you, a lot of MMA athletes are probably training the complete wrong way for their sport.
So there's like multiple factors that I would probably like to cover talking this, but I guess that the tagline is that the vast majority of, let's say MMA, let's stick there because it's where most of the recent work is in. It's easier to lock on somewhere, but the vast majority of MMA athletes train wrong. The vast majority, and by vast majority, I'm saying this is inside the UFC, this is inside the elite areas. The vast majority of these guys and girls are training almost entirely wrong. And there's reasons for this that I can kind of go into why I think later. But a lot of it's a very odd experience when we can look at elite sport, right, in other areas. So we can look at areas that are quite heavily scientifically based, and we can look at sports like endurance sports are some of the best in that case, and we can look at some of the crazy inhuman things we see getting pulled off in endurance sports, like those guys working with Nike to crack the sub 2-hour marathon, and then we have guys in the UFC gassing out in the second round, and it's like, okay, there's clearly a problem here. And we're used to a common conversation that revolves around excuses for this. He's got those type 2 fibers. He's so powerful. He can't do more than 5 minutes of activity. It's like, okay, I don't know. And the thing is that we see in sports that are very focused, we can see really crazy things being physically pulled off. And even if we think about this in the other extreme range in terms of like elite weightlifting, the amount that these people can lift is insane. And the thing is, the human body is capable of some extreme things. And that's not to say that MMA athletes are not doing extreme things, because obviously they are. And absolutely, we can't belittle the achievements of what people have done so far. But the thing is, there's a term around which basically a lot of fighters, especially, but this goes across a lot of athletes, talk about hard work. And the thing is, hard work is fine, but it has to be hard and smart for you to get the best possible outcomes. And there are a massive amounts of athletes right now that I think are wasting huge portions of energy in attempting to get something that their training is just not going to elicit. And because of that, these people, they're capable of so much more. And that's really where a lot of my passion in this area comes around. And I think the areas that are probably worth touching on and maybe worth segmenting into, and I'm pulling these off the top of my head, but would be, first of all, around the actual design of their training. So the actual specific sessions themselves. The other one would be around load management overall, which is an extremely important topic that I think MMA specifically handles very poorly. I think that probably the two most important ones is the composition of the sessions and then obviously the overall structure. There's also some reasons as to why that is, and I think a lot of it comes from issues around the way fighting is structured. But I think it's best maybe, and feel free to jump in whenever, by the way, if you want to direct me, but I feel like it's best to kind of review what MMA is physiologically speaking. Because that's probably where we get, and it's an interesting case, right? So if we look at something like Olympic weightlifting, so there's 3 energy systems for those that are not aware. The brief overview: the ATPPC system, short term, very high power; the anaerobic lactic or the glycolytic system or glycolysis, whatever you're going to call it, which is high intensity, not quite as high power output as the ATPPC, but pretty powerful, medium duration, quote unquote. And then the aerobic system, which is slower energy delivery over long periods of time. And the way that this is typically taught in physiology classes across the world, and it's something I've made very big note in the units that I teach at E34 University to be very careful to try and dispel the myth in that area, is basically we go ATP 0 to 10 seconds, glycolysis up to 40 to 60 seconds, depends on what source you're taking, and kind of up to 2 minutes. And then 2 minutes onwards is aerobic. And that's the way that we are taught how to train. That's the way that we're taught to look at these energy systems. And it's patently false in that those claims, the claims of time, are based only on if I put a gun to your head and went, go as fast as you can, and you just did that ad infinitum. And the point is that's not how most sports work. So if you walk for 10 seconds, that's not ATPPC fueled. It is your ATPPC system isn't fully draining out because you're walking for 10 seconds. It's aerobic. It's primarily determined by intensity. And this is what makes MMA a very interesting sport. And this is true for many sports are similar, but I think MMA can be especially in some areas. But is that it's an interesting blend of all these systems. And bear in mind, the systems aren't just as simple as I've stated then, but essentially what we have is if you take Olympic weightlifting, that's ATPPC. The lift is taking that period of time to rank out that system and get it lifted. If we're looking at a marathon, that is vast majority aerobic. However, there are anaerobic and ATPPC components in it. If we look at team sports like football or soccer, as they call it in my country, I guess in many countries, but that is an interesting one because if you look at the positions, the composition, the gameplay is different. A defender is playing an almost different game to a midfielder. And the midfielder is going to have more requirement on that aerobic system, and the defender is going to have more requirement on that glycolytic system. And the thing is, fighting is very interesting because essentially what we have is relatively short duration. If we take a professional MMA fight of 3 5-minute rounds, that's 15 minutes total activity. It's not a 2-hour Australian Football League, Australian AFL game. It's not, a 90-minute soccer game. It's not, how many hours they do cricket. It's none of these things. It's actually relatively short duration, but it's still it's still a long enough duration to require significant aerobic contributions, but the intensity is crazy high. Like if you, as I'm sure you've done a lot of times, and everyone watches podcasts has probably done, if you watch two dudes really duke it out, it's pretty tiring experience. Like it's pretty intense because it's punching each other in the dome. Like, and how exhausting wrestling is, trying to actively grapple. And the thing is, we look at high intensity to low intensity ratios, and in MMA it's about 1 to 4-ish. So for every part 1 you spend doing high intensity activity, you spend about 4 parts 4 doing low intensity. So if I spend 5 seconds blanking out punches, I'm likely to then spend kind of 20 punches at some point, just more so light movement and moving my hands in those in between spaces. But it's still, so it's inherently intermittent across that time, but the intensity is super high. And then the downtime is kind of aerobic. So what we get is a very interesting blend of all 3 energy systems mixed into it throughout an entire fight. And what we get then is a very difficult task to solve as someone doing conditioning. Because if you go, okay, I'm going to run a marathon, you can go, all right, well, you need a massive amount of investment in low intensity aerobic training, and massive investment right there. If you go, oh, I want to be a 100-meter sprinter, you go, okay, you need a massive amount of investment in the ATP-PC system. We can neglect kind of other ones. If you go, I want to do 400 meters, you go, okay, glycolytic system, we need to massively invest in that. They're relatively quote unquote simple questions. Now, I'm not going to call the sport simple by any stretch because they're not, but the actual proposing question initially is a lot simpler than what you get for MMA, which is, okay, it could be 15 minutes. It could also be 3 seconds if you're Jorge Masvidal flying kneeing Ben Askren in the face. It's an undisclosed, basically an undetermined length. There's only a maximum length accrued. And the activities are inherently just everything. And the ATP-PC system and the anaerobic system don't use oxygen. And the glycolytic system particularly produces a lot of metabolic byproducts that your body is super not into. And the aerobic system clears them out. So even those moments where you're doing high intensity activity, so you think of those punching exchanges, they're fueled primarily probably through glycolysis or the ATP-PC system. And then they're producing a ton of byproducts that the aerobic system has to then clear out. But if you've got poor conditioning at any part of this chain, the whole thing falls apart. If you're not well anaerobically conditioned, then during those high intensity components, your body will produce an extreme amount of metabolic byproducts that even if you have a good aerobic system, it will fail to clear it out quick enough. You'll struggle in those exchanges as well. If you have poor aerobic conditioning, then you might have good anaerobic conditioning, but you have no ability to really clear out those byproducts. And in those low intensity sections, you might actually be pretty close to what your aerobic system is happy providing. So you're not even recovering very quickly. There's all these things very deeply intertwined into each other. And not only that, you're using the entire body. It's not like just running where you're using just the legs. It is my upper body has to do explosive actions. My lower body has to do explosive actions. I have to be able to do isometric contractions in terms of, clinching and grappling. I have to do eccentric contractions. So lengthening my muscle. I have to do shortening my muscle. So concentric. It is basically the everything. It's when it goes, hey, which physical characteristic is most important for MMA? And the answer is just yes. Right?
Yeah, and it's a good overview, right? And I think that is the grassroots or the ground of it, of why it's so complicated, because it's the physiology of it is not like other sports. Like you said, if you got a marathon runner, we're not discrediting marathon running, but like really we can break it down. You need a great VO2 max and you need a great running efficiency, and anyone can work on those two things, right? It's like you said, there's a very set plan. If we want to increase that VO2 max, let's do this type of training, do this much every day. And with your running efficiency, go do this technique. But when we talk about MMA, it's like, well, we got all 3 of these energy systems. We've got to work all of them. And then there's about 4,000 different techniques you got to learn within on that. And you got to learn all your pacing and everything else. Let's go into like design of this. If someone's listening to this, or probably a better question is, what is the ideal design of a training week per se, if we've got all of these components to consider?
It's really difficult. That's the first point is that, and the interesting thing about fighters is that they will never be the best at anything in terms of physical condition, because it's basically impossible. My favorite game for training fighters is Fight Night 3 on the PlayStation 3, the greatest game of all time. Disclaimer, it's probably not the greatest game of all time, but it had a really cool system with the training, which was when you do one kind of training, it develops some characteristics, but then subtracts points from other ones. And you essentially, as you go through the game, you have to constantly pick a range of trainings to basically keep your character focusing in some areas but not letting other areas get too low, because if you focus on endurance all the time, your punching power ends up so low that you've got paladin fists and you're healing them with your punches. So it's a really interesting way to look at it, and that's kind of what training is. And the thing is that we have a relationship between the volume that someone can tank and the intensity that that volume can be. And at this point within MMA currently, they are shifted way too high to maxing out volume, but then also trying to put intensity on top of it. Unless you are taking a ridiculous amount of steroids, which, MMA doesn't have a great history of that, but let's assume clean. If you're not taking a massive amount of steroids, it's a massive thing you have to try and balance out. And it requires an understanding too that one of the things we've posited in some of the work we've done is that it's actually, even things like VO2 max are probably not the most important characteristics for fighter endurance. In fact, it's probably the second metabolic threshold. So you have some metabolic thresholds, and I won't go too in depth into it, but the point is there's a point where even if you're not at your maximal aerobic capacity, there's a point where your body starts disproportionately producing metabolic byproducts, because what happens is it doesn't go as you increase intensity, aerobic. Okay, it's anaerobic now, 100% anaerobic. It's they shift between the two. It's like a percentage dial. If it goes from, it's never 100%, but say 99%, as it goes up, it just kind of shifts over, but it's always some percentages to both, or to anaerobic and aerobic. So the important bit there is that, totally spaced now. I've distracted myself by going too much into physiology.
Volume and intensity, like, why is it problematic?
Thank you. Yes. So basically what we have is people who are essentially trying to develop this, putting in a bunch of, because the thing is for VO, I'm back. I got it. So the point with VO2 max is to increase VO2 max, it takes a massive time investment. Like, it's a very large time sink. So you're never going to wind up with cyclists who go, yeah, I cycle like 40 minutes a day, pretty good, like that, and then they're doing the Tour de France. It requires massive amounts of investment. Now for fighters, that investment in VO2 max is probably not super functional, because you're never really going to hit that VO2 max with that intermittent nature, and the amount of time investment it requires sucks away from everything else. And in my experience, which is very what you would not expect, and it's funny because I get to do this now because I've done basically a lot of testing of fighters, and we've published some studies in this area, but you just kind of get a feel for what this data looks like overall, is that fighters are actually probably vastly under anaerobically conditioned and overly aerobically conditioned, because they assign the exhaustion of aerobic training with hard work and successful training. And that's pretty much the biggest lie you could ever be told in the area of training, is that if you feel the most possibly exhausted, this is the same deal as if you lift and you don't get DOMS, or delayed onset of muscle soreness, the lift didn't count, which is totally not true. Like, we find that even without that sensation of muscle soreness, you can get significant muscular gains. They're not an integral part of that development. That's what we saw from research from like Professor Ken Nosaka in our department, who specializes in that area. Is that basically what I find, and a good example is I had an elite combat sports athlete come and do testing with me. I won't be too specific. And basically they said that they went, okay, we've got this very high level bout coming up. I won't specify the level, but it was super high level. And they've gone, okay, we want to do testing with you. And we've done the testing, and I've gone, okay, your VO2 max is very high. Your second metabolic threshold is decent, which I would argue the second metabolic threshold is probably more important, but either way, I've gone, your strength is fine. Your anaerobic conditioning is really bad. And I've gone, okay, let me guess. You can go for an unlimited pay. You can go for an unlimited time at your pace. But as soon as someone pushes a pressure on you, you gas. And the coaches have gone, like, as though I've just done dark magic in front of them. And they're like, how do you know that? And I'm like, anaerobic conditioning shit. I was like, so basically, as long as you don't produce an excessive amount of metabolic byproducts, your aerobic system can carry you. But as soon as you go, as soon as you get pushed past that second metabolic threshold far enough, you rely on the anaerobic system. It's poorly conditioned. It produces a bunch of byproducts that the aerobic system can't clear out too much. Boom, you gas out. And they've basically looked at me like I'm doing black magic. And I've gone, no, this is just really basic physiology. And I talk to them about what their training looks like. And they go, oh, well, you know, he'll run for kind of a couple of hours at a time. He'll, we do tons of rounds. This is something that's really common in combat sports, where it's like, particularly boxing and MMA, where they've gone, okay, we'll just do like 10 rounds. Let's just bang out like 10 rounds. Okay, cool. Let's do multiple hours of jiu-jitsu rolling just consecutively, so we're super exhausted. Let's do, and that's what a lot of their training focuses on. And when they go, the intensity is high, it's like, yeah, but if the intensity is high without any recovery, you're not developing that anaerobic system. To develop that anaerobic system, you have to fill it up, drain it, fill it up, drain it, fill it up, drain it. It's how you condition it as a system. You can't just go, all right, the intensity's high, I fully drained it, now just keep going. And there was a situation I was working with, because I consult with teams in terms of conditioning occasionally. I try not to do too much because I'm very time poor, but there was one that I kind of got roped into, and I was working with the person. They send this video into the chat, and it's like the athlete just like doing med ball slams, which, by the way, no. So just doing these med ball slams, like his body is moving like extremely slow, and I just get the caption torture time, and I'm like, to what purpose? Like, what's the point in the session? And we get a lot, and whenever I've had those conversations, I found coaches often retreat to the mental toughness angle, which is, you develop a lot of mental toughness by training properly. I don't see why you would have to train incorrectly to develop that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And you see this, right? And you go into any old school gym. I think Muay Thai is really bad for this, right? And they're just doing like, give me 3,000 kicks on a bag, or like just bang, bang, bang. And you're like, yeah, okay. Like, but why are you doing it? Like, what is the end goal here? What are we achieving? It's always like, oh, you know, it just conditions their mind and gets them. It's like, yeah, but pretty sure just fighting in general is going to condition your mind pretty well, isn't it?
Yeah. It's like, you know, what's better than having a really, it's better than having a medium conditioned body and a great conditioned mind, a great conditioned body, because then it doesn't require you to overcome the weakness of your own body just to function. And a lot of it comes down to, we invest too much in as well, because the aerobic system is not as simple as it's just aerobic. There's different, along this curve of intensity, there's different value of training at high intensity aerobic versus low intensity aerobic. And training, for example, a lot of it is around that second metabolic threshold. And one thing I do a lot for athletes I work with is, I'm a real big fan of running. Like, I run myself. I think running is one of the better kinds of overall conditioning you can do. And there's a couple of reasons for that it translates really well to fighting. So for example, if we think about boxing, kickboxing, or MMA, when you're striking, you're on your feet. You have to hold, your core has to be stable enough to hold yourself up. These are all things that you do when running, and you're used to moving essentially your feet you're lifting one foot and putting it down somewhere else constantly, which is something you're doing while fighting, which is why things like, generally speaking, things like a bike probably isn't going to translate quite as well. That being said, there's two kind of camps when it comes to this area, which is it's all physiology. As long as you develop the physiology, it's fine. And then there's the hyper, it's got to be sports specific crowd. And I think in terms of where I fall in this, I'm probably somewhere between the two of them, but I'm probably maybe closer to the its physiology crowd. So I'm not super, if someone prefers, you know, doing these trainings on a bike, you can definitely. But the point is, when I've talked to athletes about running, and I've usually gotten a lot of pushback. I mean, some of the coaches I work with have gone, "Oh, running doesn't work for fighting. It's not a good move." And when I've always asked them, "What is running to you?" And they've gone, "Oh, so they just go out and they run for like 2 hours." It's basically slow plodding running, which is the thing that I get thrown to me a lot. And I'm like, that ain't how I run, son. Like, and it's a difficult one because I've kind of danced around the question you initially asked me because I feel like I have to set so much groundwork to be able to answer it. And what does an actual training look like? And I'll take, for example, one of my athletes I work quite closely with. And I don't know if you watched the video I sent you, basically of the fight of this guy I work with. Yeah, he'd actually love me to say his name, so I will. So Julian Justiniano, he's I'm working with him. He's great guy, like honestly, like really, really coachable. And this was one of the reasons why I agreed to work with him, was that he came to me and he said, "I want to do MMA." He'd done 3 or something years of college wrestling, and he's back in Australia because of COVID, and was like, "Well, I want to do MMA." And I've gone, "Okay, I know a really good grappling gym you can work with. I can handle your striking with the group that I run it with, and then someone's got to handle your conditioning." And one of the reasons I agreed to work with him was that he was basically willing to do whatever he was told. And he would ask questions, but he was very insightful in the way that he would ask questions. And I basically never got pushback. And it was this opportunity where I went, okay, I can actually do exactly what I think is the ideal camp. And so, for example, when it comes, his conditioning is off the chain for a guy who just had his second amateur fight. And the video, when it eventually goes up, he just at Eternal 66, he just fought Owen Tinkombi, or Tinkom, I don't know how to pronounce that name, but he basically, Julian just dominated for 3 rounds of just endless pace, non-stop, picking him up, slamming him into the ground and pound. There was no lay and pray. It was just activity stuff. And you see at the end, like, he's pretty tired at the end of the 3 rounds, but he could have done another 3 rounds. Like, it's that level. And the thing is, his conditioning, and it's funny, since since people have seen him in their gyms, just like burning through partners, because obviously they go, "We'll do a 30-minute Shark Tank," and dudes that are coming on for single rounds are gassing out before he is. And because of this, I'm now getting a lot of people reaching out to me and going, "Well, how can I improve oh my God, you've made this monster, help us," which is, unfortunately, it takes a lot of effort. But in terms of his conditioning, right, and his is an example I'll use quite easily, is he works full time, so we have to work around his job, but he does 3 runs a week, which we have his continuous day, which is not a 2-hour slow plodding run. It's basically a usually about 40-ish minute run, focusing on where his second metabolic threshold is, and running basically threshold running.
We have a aerobic threshold, Oliver. Like, is he running at the aerobic or anaerobic threshold?
It would be whichever one aligns to. So the second metabolic threshold, which I guess in that case you would call it the anaerobic threshold. Yeah. I usually don't use the terms aerobic and anaerobic, but generally aerobic meaning the first one, anaerobic meaning the second. So we're essentially running at, and if you're at home listening and going, "Well, how do I do that? That seems complicated." It's pretty much the middle of zone 4 in your heart rate zone. If you use the heart rate reserve method, it's about slap bang in the middle of zone 4. Which, you know, there's continuous run, which is basically threshold running. There's longer interval running, which I do, you know, I vary it a lot based on what's going on, but it's usually a blend, that kind of blend between the high intensity aerobic, but glycolytic anaerobic, and then good amounts of rest between each one, so that he's actually getting to recover between efforts. Because whenever I talk to coaches mainly about what they do for intervals, generally what they do is they continuously cut the rest down, because they see that as the way to improve conditioning, which is absolutely wrong. The more you cut the rest down, just the more aerobic it becomes and the less you get anaerobic development. So there's that longer interval training, which probably usually amounts to about 30 minutes of running, 35 minutes of running. And then there's a shorter intervals day, which is, I don't do any pure ATP PC stuff, but it's now blend ATP PC and the glycolytic system with a high intensity kind of shorter medium length thrash at the end. And that, then he's got his 2 lifts a week, which I've got. I could run the list myself, but I got Matthew Plush, he was one of my master students, and he's really, really, really specialist at lifting. So I said, and Julian's friends with Matt, I went, go work with him. That's fine. The lifting is purely meat and potatoes. There's none of this crazy, grab 2 dumbbells, go like this and squat on a bocai ball. Like it's none of that. It's squats, it's deadlifts, it's shoulder presses, it's simple progressive overload over time. Him and I coordinate about whether he should be doing endurance lifting or strength lifting, and we base that on how close we are to a fight. So there's the 3 runs, the 2 lifts. We would like to get a 3rd lift in, but that is not really feasible with the timetable right now. Then he's got 2 grappling sessions a week, 2 kickboxing sessions a week, 1 MMA session a week. Sometimes we squeeze in the second one, and then he's got a wrestling session. And it's a pretty high training load, but it's actually probably lower than most fighters in terms of total time and volume spent. But the thing is, it's about getting more out of that volume. It's about getting more out of that time. So for example, the continuous run is a trash experience. Like, it sucks. Threshold running is, I threshold run every week. I more or less replicate his program for myself. And threshold running is a brutal experience. But one, if you want mental toughness, try threshold running, not plodding around for 2 hours and doing weird intervals and med ball slams until you crap your pants. But it's very purposeful. And then all the trainings are geared. There's a morning conditioning and then an evening training. Good amount of space between them. We plan his nutrition we plan all his nutrition afterwards and in between and everything. And basically we do that forever. And now the other thing which I'll have to do, and I'm sorry if I keep going on, but is we use a loading deloading cycle. So we don't just go forever that. What we have typically right now, we're doing 3 weeks of loading. So we load, and then 1 week of deloading. Within the deloading week, he does the same number of trainings, but they're all just way easier. The run is a casual, light, shorter run. The longer intervals are less of them and more rest, and intensity stays the same, and everything changes. Like, the lifts are just way lighter. The training sessions, everyone takes it easy. Those sessions for that week, there's a week of it's not just a physical replenishment, but it's also a mental recuperation as well. And the biggest problem we have in fighting, and I know I'm probably saying that a lot and contradicting myself a bunch because they're all so big, but is that people go, I just got a call from the promoter. I've got to fight in 11 weeks. Time to get in shape. No, that ain't even fair. You don't get someone who's running for a marathon in the Olympics and goes, oh, man, Olympics is 12 weeks out. Should probably start training serious, boys. Like, that's not how it works. These are multiple years of development, of physical development, to be able to achieve these things. And MMA has compounded this problem that we have people not training smart, and we have people not managing their load properly, and we have people having massive periods of downtime in non-intelligent places, not having load deloading cycles, and just losing a bunch of fitness and trying to desperately rebuild it. And from your perspective as well, a lot of yo-yoing in the weight, which is not helpful. The key is smart training, which is hard, consistently, with appropriate loaded management, which is almost every single thing that MMA is not doing as a whole right now.
So, Oliver, if people are listening to this and they're going, okay, I want to look over my timetable and have a look at this and go over, can we just quickly summarize, like, key points? You want to train this energy system, and then how do they look at their own load management? And then how would they tell, like, oh, you know what, I am overdoing the volume or I'm overdoing the intensity? Like, what things can they look for to signal that?
It's unfortunately, I don't think I have a great answer to that question, which is I just going to preface my response with that because it's a really difficult area, right? Load management is one of the hardest things to research in right now because, for example, how do you identify overtraining? There's a bunch of there's a bunch of signs and symptoms, but there's no like hard line. Congratulations, you're overtrained. Like if you got a torn ACL, they scan it and go, that's torn ACL. Boom, diagnosed. But with overtraining, it's not nearly that simple. And one of the points I make in my lectures is I go, hey, here's all the traits of overtraining. These are the physiological ones. These are some of the psychological ones. You know what they manufacture exactly? They look the exact same as your wife left you and smashed your PS5. Like the thing is, like they're so blended with life stress and other things that could happen. It's a very difficult thing to identify. I think the first thing that someone has to look at is think about if you're not training consistently, you're only training when it lines to competitions. Why? Is it because you're not motivated, or is it because it's not sustainable? When you get to the end of a camp, do you feel like, oh man, I need a real significant period off from training to let my body recover? If that's the case, you've probably not managed your load correctly. If you're having 3 hard training sessions a day, you're not managing your load correctly. Like you need to have not only I usually at least one rest day within a week. So for athletes I work with, for example, one day generally has to be in entirety a rest day, which is a day where they're encouraged to play video games. You just kind of relax, see family, do stuff like that, and don't stress about training. But you should have lighter and harder days within that week as well. So for example, if I go towards a cycle I use with one of my athletes is we have Monday has the continuous run, which is the hardest of the runs probably. And then the evening has the MMA training, which is a pretty hard session too. So that's a hard day. Tuesday is then the morning is a lift, which is medium in terms of difficulty, not super high. And the evening is one of the grappling sessions, but one of the not so hard ones. That day is a little lighter. The Wednesday is longer intervals running in the morning, and then kickboxing in the evening, which are both pretty hard sessions. Then the Thursday is a lift and one of the harder grappling sessions in the evening. So again, lighter-ish morning relative to physical load, and then the evening's a bit harder. So that's more of a medium day. Then Friday, we've got the shorter intervals run, which in terms of the total load is not super as high because it's quite a shorter session. And then the evening, we have one of the wrestling sessions, I think, which is, again, a bit lighter. But the point is, I'm not just blasting the exact same intensity of day across the entire week. I'm looking at my harder days and going, can I make the next day slightly lighter? Then I might have a hard day, then a medium day, then I might have a light day. Then Saturday is generally a hard day. And then Sunday is a full rest day. And then they start with the hardest day of the week back on Monday. And the point is, I'm undulating my training throughout the week. If you're looking at your training schedule and you're going hard day, hard day, hard day, hard day, hard day, hard day, you've done it wrong. You've absolutely done it wrong. And the thing we need to remember is that your body adapts when it recovers. It doesn't adapt during training. You don't squat and come out stronger. In fact, you come out significantly weaker. So I did deadlifts this morning. I actually PB'd my deadlift for 3 across 5 sets. And I am not strong right now. In fact, I'm very weak. But the point is, over the next couple of days as I recover, that's when I adapt. If you aren't recovering properly, you aren't adapting properly. And that's why it's crucial for a lot of people to probably swallow their pride and train less. And most of my work with athletes at this point is desperately trying to persuade them to train less. but to train smarter, be very directed with what you do. And, you might need some technical sessions that you can add in, but a light technical session is easy to add in and going, well, looks like it's time to bang out 10 rounds and build up some mental toughness, which is just, and, I saw a post recently from from a coach who's gone, all right, well, we've now done this morning, we did this massive grappling session and then a bunch of rounds, and this is how you get success. You work harder than your opponent. I've just thought, well, no, actually, that's probably just how you wear out your athletes. You slow down their development and you create a cycle of burnout that will hinder them for the rest of their career.
What would you say to, say, amateur athletes who don't have control over their schedule? Because what we're saying now is pretty easy to do for a professional athlete who has a whole team around them, and they've got conditioning coaches, they've got specific coaches to them, they've got people like me and the team. We can all sit around and go, okay, how's Mr. X's training schedule? Let's do this. We got an open gym and we could do X, Y, and Z on these days. Amateur guys, they kind of have to rock up to the gym, right, and just go by the schedule the coach has set. Yeah. What's the best approach for those guys?
They're in a very difficult position. And the main thing is to work within your own limitations and communicate what you think is best for your body very clearly. So one thing I haven't got to touch on is one of the reasons why I think this is most prevalent in MMA, and I'll quickly bang out this and then circle back, which is one of the biggest problems we have with MMA is how specialized it is. And what I mean by that is, if you have a black belt in jiu-jitsu, beautiful, very nice, amazing achievement, crazy level of achievement, you are extremely qualified to choke people. That doesn't mean you know how to manage someone's conditioning. It doesn't mean you know how to manage making someone stronger. It doesn't mean you manage knowing how to train people even in grappling, because knowing something and being able to teach someone something is not the same thing. It doesn't mean that you can do overall load management. It doesn't mean any of these things. What it means is you're really good at choking people, and you're probably better at training people to choke people than most. So the point there is, I want to be really clear that I'm not undermining the achievement of acquiring a black belt in jiu-jitsu. It's an incredible achievement, but we need to understand exactly what it is. And if we think of it in terms of academic qualifications, I'd think of a black belt in jiu-jitsu as a PhD in grappling. That's the person I go to when it comes to grappling. But in the same sense that you wouldn't come to me and go, bro, can you explain the Big Bang to me? It's like, mate, it's not my PhD. It's not what my PhD was in. Why are you asking me this? Like, it's the exact same thing that PhDs are highly specialized. Like, I am a performance physiologist with specializations in weight management. Those are the areas which I should be commenting on. Like, outside of those areas, if someone asked me about psychology or something like that, I shouldn't be commenting. And the same is true. And the thing with MMA as well is there's not a great amount of money in it. So it's not as easy for a coach to go, all right, well, I'll have this conditioning coach, and I'll have a conditioning coach, I'll have a strength coach, I'll have a dietitian here, I'll have this here. It's hard to resource all those things. So these coaches end up basically going, oh yeah, I'll do it, which basically results in, let's bang out like 3 rounds of sparring, boys. That's conditioning, which is just not the case. So to circle back to an amateur athlete, I think the important thing to realize is, first of all, the same thing that we all realize as we grow up eventually, is that our parents aren't flawless. They are just grown-up children, which is to say, you realize that your coaches aren't flawless. Your coaches are probably lacking a lot of knowledge, which is not their fault, and they have knowledge which is very important to you. But it's trying to make sure that you can actually look at your schedule realistically and fit in, at least looking at those different areas, trying to address each of them at least a little bit. And the beauty of the way that I'm talking about training is that it's actually better for an amateur athlete than what the professionals are doing. Because what the professionals are currently doing is this unrealistic workload of, I'm just going to do, my conditioning is 3 hours of sparring, which is like, okay, are you doing 3 hours of fighting? Okay, odd strat. You're not even doing close to that, so, and again, in that, what are you going to be building specifically physiologically within that session? Do you not know? Okay, well, maybe there's no point in the session. But what we're doing is trying to have a smaller amount of total time spent training and a greater amount of time spent being very specific. And when you're an amateur athlete and you don't have a lot of time, you have to be even more valuable. You have to be even more careful with that time because it's so valuable. And it's going, and at an amateur, by the way, as a side note, one of the most important things is skill development. So you're focused because you have to think about what a development cycle is. And in your development cycle, that starts from the day you decide you want to do this until the day you decide you don't want to do this anymore. That's your development cycle. That might be 6 months. That might be 25 years. It's whatever. But in those early stages, your conditioning will come with doing some training, with you doing your general fight training. And you won't have optimal conditioning from that, but you will get some. But what you will build is skill, and that skill level is really crucial early. As you start to realize that you need to develop conditioning outside of that, you need to think about, and it's difficult because I would say go get personal trainers and stuff like this, but honestly, I would even say a vast majority, I talk to various other conditioning coaches who even claim to specialize in MMA, and usually when I talk to them, I'm like, bruh, you're not amazingly informed. And a lot of it is, again, borderline pro. Like I talked to one ages ago who's a specialist who I was talking about like threshold running and stuff like that, and they're like, oh man, I've never even done that with any of my athletes. I'm like, what? So you specialize in conditioning, grappling out in any kind of conditioning, combat athletes, and they're not doing any kind of like threshold development. It's like, no, it's like, oh my God. So unfortunately, I don't want to paint a negative picture, but the picture currently is quite negative. Yeah, but you don't need to spend 2 hours plodding around on the streets feeling very sad. So I can at least save that for you. Run faster and shorter. It'll probably help.
Yeah, it's a really good overview, and we're coming up to time. The very last question I do want to ask you, Oliver, it comes back to that: do we keep it sport specific, or do we just train physiology? This is a question I know a lot of people are going to be thinking because it's such a highly used tool when we talk about development and conditioning. The assault bike. Dr. Oliver Barley, are you a fan of the assault bike?
I'm medium on the assault bike, so I prefer the assault bike to a standard cycle ergometer because it at least requires upper body and lower body activation. The problem is how I see the assault bike used is, and the thing with things like assault bikes and bikes like that is, and this is one of the reasons why I like road running, is because things like continuous exercise and threshold running is actually, I've found, and this depends on the athlete, considerably easier to motivate when you're running around outdoors. And you address natural hills that show up and stuff like that. Whereas going on an assault bike, going, all right, I need you to do 40 minutes pretty much trying to stay in this area of a heart rate zone can be very, very difficult. So most of the time what I see with assault bikes are people just spamming intervals, and very purposeless intervals. So like I've had people reach out to me and go, can you improve my training? And one of the things I did was I've had it's almost always, and it's funny because I know a bunch of people I know will listen to this, and a lot of them have probably listened across this podcast and think, are you talking about me? And if you are, almost definitely no, because you might think you're the only person to have asked me for help with something, but there's at least 50 something in the past, 2 months or something. But almost always when they go to look at my conditioning and it's an attack bike one, it's almost always, all right, so I'm going to do like 35-second sprints, and I'm going to have like 15 seconds rest, and then I'm going to do an 8-minute effort of light, and then I'm going to repeat that whole thing 3 times and see what's going on there. And I'm looking at it, I'm going, I literally don't know what this is. I don't know what the purpose of this is. I don't know what's that 4-second sprint you're talking about. What's this? What is the point of this session? Which is like, I generally ask that question, I get back, oh, I don't know, I was hoping you would tell me. And it's like, well, no, you've just kind of given me a bunch of random stuff and gone, can you fix this? And I've gone, I wouldn't fix it. I would just burn it all down and start again. But the point is, there are very legitimate uses for an attack bike. And I would prefer, because just if you're doing MMA, you're using your lower body, you're using your trunk, and you're using your upper body. So generally, if you can find some kind of activity for your conditioning that encompasses all of those, so it's the reason why cycling on just a standard bike is probably not super ideal. Because you're leaning on the bar, you don't have an amazing amount of trunk stability, and you're not really using your upper body, so you're very leg focused. The attack bike, at least you're using the upper body as well, and you also have to stabilize your core to drive into the upper body, so it is an improvement. The reason I like running is because very leg heavy, but also requires obviously my trunk to be active to stabilize myself. And there is some degree of arm activation with the pumping back and forth, which I don't know, when you started running, I actually found I actually had DOMs in like my upper back and front delts and stuff. So it's having to think about what your conditioning is and going, does this hit a lot of the areas that I know to be important? And generally, you're going to have to make sure that you're not just thinking about, well, if I put in more time, I'll get more success, because that's almost definitely not the case. The vast majority of guys training MMA, and almost any combat sport for that matter, are putting in more than enough time, and they're putting more than enough effort. They're just not directing it right.
Yeah, I think that's a good spot to finish this. We are coming up to time. I know we've done this many times, Dr. Ollie B, but if people are listening to this and they go, you know what, my schedule sucks and I am doing this, my volume is too high, my intensity is too high, and I do feel like my girlfriend or wife or boyfriend or husband or whatever has left me and they just smash my PS5. It's horrible. And they want to reach out to you and they go, I need you to look at my training schedule. What's the best way for them to do it?
So the best way to reach out to me is to get in touch with me. Either I'm on Instagram, and I literally don't even know what my Instagram is. I use it a bit, but I don't know. I guess just search Oliver Barley. I'm pretty sure it's Oliver Barley. It's Oliver Barley. I think it's oliverbarley.phd, which is like the most lame one I could have picked, but I'm pretty sure it's just like, yeah, I'm only using this to track other people, but now I get people messaging me through that. And there's also Twitter, which is just at Oliver Barley. Though I will point out to note, I'm happy for people to get in touch, but I'm extremely time poor. So if I get entire schedule sent to me and go, oi, fix my schedule, I'd be like, oi, pay me $5,000. I don't actually, that's not the quote, but yeah, look, that Instagram or Twitter are probably the best ways to reach out to me. And I'm happy to generally address a couple of questions here and there.
Yeah, well, that's a lot of free information given out here that a lot of people will take value for.
Oh, actually, one thing I would point out is there is a paper which I wrote, which is probably there's a couple which are pretty helpful in this area. There's two that I would address mainly. So I'll just read out the titles of them. One of them is exploring the physical and physiological characteristics relevant to mixed martial arts. That's published in the Strength and Conditioning Journal. The first author on that is Matthew Plush, the guy I was talking about before, and I'm the last author on that, so the supervising author. That one, I believe, is behind a paywall, but there's sneaky ways to get it. And also, if you're struggling, you can just contact me and I'm sure I can send you a PDF. And the other one which I would recommend is, where is it? Yes, considerations when assessing endurance in combat sports athletes. So that's an open access paper, so everyone should be able to get it. It's published in Frontiers in Physiology. In that paper, I and my co-authors talked about how to best test endurance in combat sports athletes, because strength testing is pretty easy to do and well defined at this point, but endurance in combat sports is very poorly defined. So in that paper, we had to talk a great deal about what made up for quote unquote endurance in combat sports. And I think more or less everything I've said today is kind of outlined in that paper somewhere. So that one's probably a pretty helpful one to read as well. I think reading both of those papers would be your best first bet if you're looking to improve your training relative to things that I know, because they're pretty useful, if I don't say so myself.
All right, there you go. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. First, listen to this podcast. Second, read those papers. If you're still confused and you're still convinced that you need Dr. Oliver Barley's help, go get $5,000 and send him a message.
Yeah, $5,000. $5,000 a message. I'll send you invoice on the message, mate.
All right, Dr. Ollie B, thank you again for coming back on.
Thanks for having me on. I genuinely enjoy talking about this topic. So everyone needs to rest more. There you go. Finish on that.